Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in. Obviously, cabin fever has overtaken Zoomitis, and anything to get out to the outside world. This is an immensely ambitious project I've started on, and its origins actually were with the Open University. When I was doing an art course down in Southampton, what they call their external studies.
Tim, we've just lost you for a second.
Or did you lose me?
Yes, you were doing an external study.
Yes, on Byzantine art. It's told, the computer's very unkind. It's told me I'm unstable. So it's going to be okay. Anyway, I was doing this course on Byzantine art, and the regional director said, would I do a course for the Open University? And it was what some of you may know, it was called the A100 Foundation course. And I said, yes, that's fine. Then I was a little bit surprised to find that my first student was in the high security prison on the Isle of Wight, the Albany prison. So that was my introduction to the Open University. Anyway, I did an art course for them and thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was nice to move away from some of the ancient art and look at other areas. But it is, as I say, a very ambitious thing I'm trying to do. And what I want for us to look at tonight is really to understand how the form and the style and the way we represent things came about in Western art. And there's a long and interesting history. And we are, of all the animal species, we are the only animal that is able to do representation. Now, we know that there's been experiments with chimpanzees, and they can make patterns and they can use colors, but they can't actually represent anything. And so this is an interesting idea for neuroscientists as to why we want to make it. And I think I have some answers to it, but is that in our lives, human life, everything is a little bit arbitrary. And much of what we do in our culture is to try and control that. Because we have imaginations and consciousness, again, something other animals don't appear to have, we constantly are imagining what the future is, and we're constantly trying to control it. Could I have my first slide, please, Caroline? And here we go. Now, I don't know if you can see this very well. Don't panic over this slide. And there are two things that have happened with it. One is the software has slightly distorted the figures, so that's a bit tricky. But the other is it's going to reappear several times. So don't worry about absorbing it all. Try and absorb this bit here. And I'm trying to see if I can get a bigger view.
Tim, would you like me to point particularly to a particular area?
No, I'm just going to, what I'm going to do is just try and, if I can get the slide, it's on my screen, it's very small, so I really need a little bit bigger. Can everybody see it all right? They're nodding, yes. So if we just stick to this bit here, the Palaeolithic, this is what I really want you to concentrate on. And what I've tried to spell out here is what we're going to be looking at. Now, you'll notice this is quite interesting. In the last few years, 3 sites in Spain where Neanderthals lived, we've discovered some colorings on the walls. Can't really describe them as very representational, but we do know now that these Neanderthals, who we have been so critical of in the past, the knuckle scraping, rather bovine and stupid Neanderthals, are actually turning out to be much cleverer than we thought. And of course, as I've mentioned, some of you have been in previous talks, as I mentioned, of course, we've got anyway within our DNA probably 2.5 to 2 3/4% Neanderthal DNA. So we've inherited some of that Neanderthal, and there they are, actually being much more sophisticated now than we originally thought. Now, I'm not going to show you any Neanderthal art because it's not very representational. We are going to look at the Paleolithic period, and in particular, the sort of characteristics we're going to see is a form of naturalism but rather abstracted, stylized. And what has really enthused art historians, I suppose, about Paleolithic art is its vitality and its liveliness. So we'll be looking for that. And the sites we're going to be looking at are mainly in Spain, Altamira, and then we're going to look at Lascaux in France, which some of you may have visited, although, of course, you can't actually go to the real caves because they've had to create a copy, because the real caves have suffered from humans, really, just breathing out our CO2 and ruining the colouring. And we're also going to look at some figurines as well as cave paintings, early figurines, and these figurines come from Germany and Austria and from France itself. So we'll be looking at those. So what's going on at this time? Well, the end of the Ice Age and so on. The Pleistocene period. So we're going back a long way. Next slide, please, Caroline. So just to look at the sites, Altamira here in Spain, where my cursor is now, Lascaux here in France, then Willendorf up here, and Hohenstein-Saddel there, and not actually on this map here, but we're going to go to a place in France very near Lascaux called Le Sel. So next slide, please. And here we are looking at the cave paintings. And I've worked out how to make my slide bigger. That's better. My eyesight was struggling there. Now, up on your left-hand corner, we've got Altamira, the cave of Altamira. And what you've got, you can see deer and what almost like wildebeest in all sorts of positions on the caves in these beautiful earth colors. And you can see how they've caught the vitality of the animals. The painters have caught them, but they're just jumbled. They're just pushed there into the cave and quite far away into the cave. So there's no light. So they'd have to be painted by artificial light. So paleontologists, anthropologists start thinking about this. Why? What's going on here? It can't be just for aesthetics, because who's going to see it at the back of the cave with hardly any light? Now these were discovered in the 19th century, but much nearer and earlier, it's rather later. In 1940, a young boy was walking his dog, but it fell down a hole. And he and his friends then went down to find the dog, and what they found was these caves in Lascaux. And you can see over the right here, these caves lit up, and you can see some paintings here, and these are replicated down the bottom. Can you see that all right? And you've got a bull, horse, deer, another bull, all painted over each other. And you also get, as we see here in Altamira, people's hands. And we think what they did was they blew their paints, mainly earth paints, across their hands and left these marks. So apart from the fact that we've got these stylized and very lively paintings, what is going on? Why are they painting these deep in the caves, and in Lascaux, right in the back of the caves, quite difficult to access, in the dark? Why? What's happening? Now, I mentioned earlier about our need to try and control. And what we think is going on here is something that is really quite religious in many ways, but what we would now classify more as magic. What seems to be happening here is that our Paleolithic ancestors are trying to control their survival. And in this particular case, it's their food source. They're hunters. And what they need to do is to control those animals. And hunting is actually, and you may have seen some modern hunters like in the Kalahari or elsewhere, hunting is actually a very precarious and difficult thing. 2/3 of the time, if not 3/4 of the time, the animals get away. And it's quite tricky. So if you can try and bring good luck and magic on your side to capture those animals, then you've got more control. And what we think, what anthropologists and paleontologists think is going on here is that our ancestors are trying to control the animals, just in the way that you might have some pre-literate tribes doing rain dances to bring rain. Here we've got Paleolithic ancestors trying to control their food source. Now this becomes even more interesting. Next slide, please. When we look at another set of art objects from these periods. And what we're looking at here are some figurines. Now, if we start on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the Lion Man from Hohenstein in Stadel, 40,000 years ago, we think, made of mammoth ivory. Now, when the Lion Man was originally discovered, he was in 200 pieces. So you can imagine the work that has gone in to putting him together. And in fact, we're not quite certain that he is a man now. He might well be a lion woman, though probably the more likelihood that he is a lion man. And this is what's called a zoomorphic figure. And zoomorphic figures often appear. This shows a humanoid with an animal head or animal parts. And again, it seems to be something about respecting and trying to control the animal forces of nature. So it's about the survival. Whereas if we move across now to the next figure, we're clearly looking at a pregnant woman, a very fertile woman. And of course, that leads to the second thing that we need to control as a species to survive is our fertility. And we find dozens of these figurines across the Paleolithic period in different sites. And they've often been termed Venuses or goddesses. And it looks like they are, again, some form of magic for sculpture to try and control the fertility. And if you think about it, it's fairly obvious in some ways. For early human beings, in terms of survival, food and fertility were absolutely crucial. So we've got art here, which is representing something very powerful in terms of the culture of that society, in religious terms, or magical terms, as we might call them, what we call sympathetic magic. For anthropologists, there's two types of magic. There's sympathetic magic and there's contagious magic. Sympathetic magic is creating something that is close to the original. And so this figurine represents a pregnant woman, the fertility of the community, and important. Contagious magic is much more when you have an object that provides you with magic, and you only have to think in terms of the Christian church, and you think of holy relics. And if you think about the relic of St. Albans, the shoulder blade of St. Albans, that has power, magical power, religious power, which is contagious. So contagious and sympathetic. But here we've got sympathetic magic. And if we look at the next figure on the right over here, the Venus or woman of Lucelle, 25,000 years ago, very near Lascaux, carved actually into the limestone rock. And as you can see, about 8 inches tall, quite near, in that area, quite near Bordeaux. And again, what we've got is a woman, large breasts, swollen stomach, big hips, all the things that you need for fertility. And interestingly enough, she's holding a horn. Now, that might be a phallic symbol, it might be an association with wildlife, we can't be sure. I mean, one of the problems, of course, in all this analysis I'm giving you of this art is that the people who made it are not around to tell us why they did it or what it's about, and we don't have any record or literature, of course. So it's open to all sorts of speculation. But I think the foundations of the idea that human beings are trying to control their environment in terms of their food supply and their fertility makes a lot of sense. Next slide, please. Now, we're moving down to the Neolithic New Stone Age. And the Neolithic period is a period of huge change. We're going to look at religious carvings, wall paintings, portraits, and narratives. So we've got two more things that have in the terms of advance. Portraits and narratives we haven't seen before in the Paleolithic. We're going to look at two sites in Turkey, and they represent what's known as the Neolithic Revolution. And some of you will know all about the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution, as it's called, was when human beings started farming and started having permanent settlements, rather than being hunter-gatherers who were often on the move, although it's fair to say that some of our ancestors, of course, did return to particular caves at certain points. But the idea of actually growing your own food and having a permanent settlement starts with the Neolithic. So we have farming and pastoralism. Next slide, please. And here we are in Turkey, visiting two sites. Göbekli Tepe here, which is near the Syrian border, and this very famous site, Çatalhöyük. I remember this site as an archaeological student because it was a very important site, a very early Neolithic site in the 8th century, running down to the 6th century, and it was excavated by an Anglo-Dutch archaeologist, James Millart. And he was famous at the time I was a student because he'd been found out for fabricating evidence from the site. It was a bit of a scandal, so of course it stuck in your mind. But the site is a fascinating site. But let's just go back first to Göbekli Tepe, which is slightly earlier, as you can see, the 10th millennium rather, and it's a fascinating site. There are over 200 pillars in a circle. It almost reminds you of Stonehenge, though they're not quite as high as Stonehenge, and they're often carved. Now this one, I don't know if you can guess what this is, but it's been identified as a fox carved on the side. And we have quite a few animal representations from Göbekli Tepe, and it looks like they're there for a religious purpose. Some of the columns are as high as 10 feet and weighing over 10 tons. There was a lot of work put into it, and we still can't be certain exactly whether it was a separate religious site or whether it was a part of a settlement. We're not sure. But we've got some art there, and it's animal art generally, and it's carved in relief. Something perhaps, again, controlling food supply. But if we go to Çatalhöyük now, we've got three pieces of evidence from there. First of all, we've got this deer hunt here. And you can see these little men running with spears. So we've got human representation, and they're pursuing their food. And notice how the scale is so interesting. The deer, of course, is the most important thing. So it's, if you like, abstracted. And abstract just means pulling away from reality in this case, so that it takes center stage. And often we find with a lot of what we would call early art from pre-literate societies that the emphasis of the art is always to exaggerate the thing that you're focusing on, so that that gets preeminence. Now, if we go down here on the right, and you can hardly really see this on the wall, but a transcription of it here on the bottom shows what may be a volcano erupting. Here's the settlement, which seem to be houses. Here's the volcano, and it looks as if it's erupting. Now, near Çatalhöyük, there is a mountain called Dag Hassan, and it is volcanic. But the last time it erupted, according to geologists, was 34,000 years ago. So no one doing this painting of 6,150 before the Christian era could possibly have seen the volcano erupting. So it's an interesting puzzle. Was the story of the volcano erupting passed down in tales from one generation to the next? It'd be nice to think that, but of course we can't tell. But we have also got this little seated figure here, and you can see she's tiny, 6.5 inches, in baked clay, head missing, but she's clearly a woman giving birth. Here she is, and here's the baby's head, and there she's sitting in a birth position. Again, fertility. Is she a fertility goddess, or is this a representation of someone giving birth, which we want to try and control and make sure that that birth is successful? And some of you will have heard me going on before about how difficult human birth is, because we've adapted to walk on two legs. We've made life so difficult for women so that their birth canal is so narrow, and birth was such a precarious thing. And even now, with all our modern medicine and modern science, birth is really tricky. And if we didn't have cesarean operations, a lot of births would end with the death of the baby or even the death of the mother. So birth for our ancestors must have been a nightmare. And so often they would have lost the child or lost the mother. So you can imagine how important it was for a society to maintain fertility and for those children to be born successfully. So again, it probably is something religious, but again, it might be just hoping that the next birth, that this will somehow provide that sympathetic magic to make that birth successful. So we're moving on now, next slide please, from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, the Metal Age, where things start to take off in terms of technology. Fire and metal have been the real advancement of human beings. Our ability to control fire and our ability to use metal and extract metal from the earth has pushed us down along the modern road to technology. And of course, now we're going at an even rapider pace. But the discovery of how to make bronze was crucial. The mixture of copper and tin sent human beings rushing into the technological age. So we're going to look at some sculpture. And from that, because we've now got settlements, permanent settlements, we start to see hierarchies developing. It's well known amongst anthropologists that when you look at hunter-gatherers, and for example, if you look at the Kum in South Africa, they have very little hierarchy because everyone's very equal, because their food supply is pretty precarious. They have no permanent possessions. Once you start having settlements, then hierarchies start developing, because some people acquire more and control more and others don't. And specialisms come in. So you have particular castes of people, the rulers, the priests, the architects, the builders, the potters, as well, of course, as the farmers who provide the food and keep them going. So we're going to see hierarchical art, more portraiture, and some more stylization, which almost becomes sort of geometric. And the objects we're going to look at is a wonderful mask, very early mask from Waka in Iraq, a head from Nineveh in Iraq, and a bronze figurine also from Iraq. So we're looking at, you can see here, sorry, it's got a bit cut up by the date there, but we're looking at the Sumerian civilization, the earliest Mesopotamian civilization, which invented writing. You can see Hammurabi, 1780, his law code gives us our first writing. And of course, it's the same time, in religious terms, that Abraham is founding the monotheistic religions. So Judaism, very important. Next slide, please. So what we're talking about here, this is the Fertile Crescent, so-called Fertile Crescent, where farming starts. And I should have pointed out, we're not in Europe, of course, we're in the Middle East, and that's where the farming starts, probably due to, in particular, the rivers, and of course, the early civilization of Mesopotamia is down here. And that's followed by the Akkadian, followed by the Assyrian. So we've got a set of important civilizations, and it's linked to over here, the Hittites. So the Sumerians are really the first major civilization. Cities with specialized crafts, records, keeping records of what they've got, and rulers and priests and temples, and of course, the famous ziggurats. had a ziggurat in St Albans. It wasn't a real ziggurat. I don't know why that building was nicknamed the ziggurat, because it's nothing like a ziggurat. Ziggurats, of course, are generally stepped and go up to a point. We think they're connected to the biblical idea of the Tower of Babel. Anyway, back to the Sumerians and to this wonderful mask, alabaster mask from Waka, just north of Baghdad. Our earliest mask, 3,300 BC to we could go back.
Sorry.
That's all right.
There we go.
There we are. 3,300 BC, or before the Christian era. Egyptian alabaster. You can see it's not very large, only 20 centimeters. And this was in the National Museum of Iraq, along with this bronze head, wonderful bronze head, probably of Sargon, or maybe his grandson Nim. We're not sure, but like to give it to Sargon, a ruler of Akkad, 12 inches high, the ruler there, 2,334 to 2,284. Also in the National Museum in Baghdad. The sad story is that in 2003, in the Iraqi war, they were stolen and disappeared. Now, fortunately, the mask of Waka has turned up, but the head of Sargon is still missing. Now, just look at this bronze head. Now, you'll notice, of course, the eyes are very damaged, and we think that was deliberate, because the ears, you can't see from this slide, but the ears have been cut off, and the nose has been cut off. And those of you who attended my Diocletian talk will remember I talked about rulers their memories being damned. Well, it seems to have happened here either to Sargon or his grandson. They have been damned, and someone has taken a blunt instrument to this beautiful bronze head. But look at the patterning of the beard and the sheer precision, a wonderful piece of bronze casting, beautifully done, and emanating the status, the power of this ruler. You understand when you look at this sculpture, this is someone of incredible importance and preeminence. So we've got this portraiture which comes and is linked to the politics of hierarchy and to the idea of stratified societies. So we might some days, some way long for the more egalitarian societies of the hunter-gatherers. But in terms of technical advancement, there's no doubt that civilization and permanent settlements moved humankind forward. And then over on the right, and I mentioned this in terms of sort of geometric, we have a figurine of a man. He's got a square box on his head, which may be something religious. He's naked and he's advancing with his arms to his side, as if you might be walking or marching with one foot forward. It's a wonderful little bronze, just 14 and a bit inches high, and now in the museum, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But an very early example of how skilled the Sumerians were and the Akkadians were in their use of bronze, this new material which was so important, and of course very important in terms of warfare, because Sumeria, Arcadia, the Assyrians, of course then, and the Hittites were always fighting, and the Assyrians of course built themselves a big empire. So one of the negative aspects of permanent settlements is people wanted the resources of their neighbors, and so warfare became technologically advanced and more dangerous through the use of metal. Next slide, please. And we're now moving to perhaps the best known and well established of these ancient societies, the Egyptian society. Egypt had some advantages in that it was reliant on the Nile, but the Nile was itself very reliable. Whereas in Mesopotamia, although the Tigris and the Euphrates supplied the water to flood the crops, it was much less reliable. I think I've lost the slides, Caroline, or I have. Can you get them back?
It could be that she's fallen out of the Zoom and will have to re-enter. If you're happy to continue, Tim.
Yes, I'll carry on.
Yes.
You can't actually see what I'm going to be talking about, but let me just talk about Egypt in the sense, because we know it's a wonderful long civilization with a huge record of pharaohs and culture, which runs through this period. And I say it traded strongly with the Mesopotamian civilizations, but it became the superpower, if you like, of the Near East. And what we're going to be looking at is how they use art in a very hierarchical fashion and a very stylized fashion to cement their culture. Caroline, you can take us to the slide of Abu Simbel. And there it is. Hooray! There we are. Fantastic. So this is the new site where all the stone blocks were moved and reassembled up the hillside so they were not flooded. And of course it's down, there it is, down on the map. Can you see on the map there? So there it is. And these amazing hierarchical sculptures of Ramesses II. For was he sending a message about power? Wow. You know, I am the fair, and the diminutive wives are all scattered down around. You could probably see a diminutive wife there. So again, scale is used to tell you the status of someone, how important are, you know, well, I know as a tall person how important tall people are. Anyway, Ramesses was making a huge message, and art, the stylized art, was about showing power. But of course, it had another purpose. And it all related to Egyptian religion and the importance of the afterlife. Talk about magic, the sympathetic magic. The idea was that you could take it with you. You could take everything into the afterlife. And of course, that's why their tombs were packed with treasures and everyday things that they were going to take to the next world, which of course made them very vulnerable to tomb robberies. But that religious feeling also permeated through their art. Now, I've got down here a tomb painting, famous tomb paintings from Egypt, wonderful tomb painting. This is the feast of Neb Amun, Amun of course being the god, Neb Amun, showing musicians, dancers in the chapel. Now, think, what is unusual about this tomb painting? Have a look at it carefully. What is completely unusual in terms of your understanding of Egyptian painting? And it comes from Karnak over here. Well, what you've got there are two women here facing us. And almost 99% of Egyptian wall painting, you only ever see the profile of the person with, of course, the eye frontally facing. So this completely changes that. It was really surprising when the archaeologists discovered this, because they got so used to the Egyptian profile style. And the tomb paintings, Egyptian tomb paintings, are really amazing and tell us so much about Egyptian life. But I'll come on to that. Next slide, please. Well, I suspect most of you recognize this amazing head. This is the most wonderful piece of Egyptian art, and it comes from a very odd period in Egypt. This, of course, is the bust of Nefertiti, and Nefertiti was married to the pharaoh Akhenaten, and Akhenaten tried to change the religion of Egypt by moving away from Amun to the sun god. And it was all about Ram the sun. He built a new capital, which was at Amarna, and he had this his artist produced this very odd style of art, which we think may have related actually to some genetic defect that P possibly had. But let's have a look at this wonderful bust of Nefertiti. It's plaster, painted plaster on stone, and it's polychrome, lots of different colors, and she wears this crown cap. And again, it's quite elongated, which may be just the style, but may also represent the style of that art, this elongated art of Akhenaten. We know it's, or we think it's by Tutmosis, because it came from Tutmosis, his workshop in Amarna. And it's a wonderful portrait, full of beauty, aesthetic beauty and power. Interesting enough, her left eye is missing. There's a right eye of quartz, and that's led to all sorts of speculation. Was Nefertiti, did she only have one, etc., etc. We'd love to, archaeologists love to speculate all about this. But in terms of a piece of art, it's aesthetically wonderful. It has this feminine, slender neck, wonderful cheekbones, great coloration, just a superb portrait from Egypt. How sophisticated, and you can't help feeling that, yes, it served a hierarchical purpose. It demonstrated the royal family. Yes, it may also have had a purpose in being sympathetic to the next afterlife, but also surely here we've got pleasure in beauty. And the aesthetics of art and the importance of aesthetics to human beings, we shouldn't let go of, because although I've been talking in rather practical terms, art serving a religious or practical purpose, art is also, of course, for the ancients, has this amazing aesthetic quality. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move to the core of this talk, the main part of it, which is the Greeks. Greek art, which has such a huge influence on Western art. We're going to start with the Minoans, who had a lot of influence from Egypt and is quite stylized. We're going to actually not go to Crete, but we're going to go to Akrotiri. Many of you will know Santorini, and I'd like to bet quite a few have been to Santorini and probably seen Akrotiri, a marvelous site. And then we're going to look at Mycenaean art on the mainland. The Greek-speaking people who took over in Crete, took over at least Knossos, because we have their writing there, Linear B. And then we're going to look at Greek art, main Greek art. You can't see it here, but I do apologize for this slide, but we'll have the archaic, the early classical, we'll have the mature classical, and we'll look at how the Greeks take what is quite a stylized form of art and they become more and more naturalistic, more idealistic, and proportions and balance become the key to Greek art, which has so, I'm going to use the word infected, if you like, Western culture and civilization. First through the Romans, but then, of course, after the medieval period, through the Renaissance, and how dominant that became through the Enlightenment, right up to the 19th century, when artists then become more experimental and start moving away from naturalism to something much more abstract. Next slide, please, then. So we're going to go to Thera down here, Akrotiri. Just losing my cursor. Here it comes. There we are, there. And then we're going to move over to Mycenae here. And then when we get into mainland Greece, of course, we're going to be focused a lot on Athens and Attica and some of the other Greek sites. Next slide, please. Two of my favorite ancient wall paintings. Now, we actually start on the right over here, and we're going back to the tomb of Neb Amun. And it's one of the wall paintings from his tomb. And I love this. and it's called a fowling scene. It's a hunting scene of hunting birds. And here he is. And of course, he's the big man, and his wife, slightly more diminutive. And I love this, his daughter. And we know it's his daughter from the shaved hair there, sitting there. And he's grabbing birds. He's about to kill them. He's hunting. And this almost paradise, beautiful papyri, the fish, and I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, it's a demonic cat biting a bird, some poor bird not escaping. Did the Egyptians really take cats hunting? Oh, I can't believe the cats would never give up their food. But it's isn't a wonderful scene? So full of pleasure and I say almost it's the afterlife of paradise. This is what food so really available.
Tim,
profile.
we just lost you for a second. You were talking about the beauty of afterlife, the delight of afterlife.
Oh yes, well, I was just saying how did you get the bit about the demonic cat?
We did get the demonic cat, thank you.
Right, you've got the demonic cat, and I'm just saying the stylized and the profile and so on. Now, over here we have a fresco and it is a fresco, generally painting on wet plaster of from Akrotiri in Thera, and it's very Minoan in style. This probably priestess, though again this is all speculation, but we get many figurines and paintings in Minoan culture of bare-breasted young women with wasp waists and these billowing skirts and this wonderful hairstyle, and she's so elegant, so precise, that you almost feel she's naturalistic, but of course it's false. It's a stylized development. Isn't it superb in a way? She leans over to pluck the flower, and it has the vitality, but also pleasure. It's just so relaxing, and so the lines so clear, drawn beautifully lines. The artist has complete control, and you feel her flexibility, her warmth. Superb piece of fresco painting, and we're talking about here 15th century, before of course Thera or modern Santorini, which many of you will know about, was blown to pieces when the volcano erupted. Some volcanologists think probably the biggest explosion that we ever had in northern Europe, in the Mediterranean. On to the next slide then. And we move over now to Mycenae, where in a way we lose some of that fluidity. But I couldn't help but I had to put Tutankhamun's wonderful death mask up and compare it with the so-called mask of Agamemnon. We don't know who it belonged to, but Schliemann, the German archaeologist who excavated, you may be Schliemann, back in the 19th century, who was so imbued with Homer, so in love with Homer, couldn't resist saying this ruler must be Agamemnon, this wonderful golden death mask, but quite stylized, quite basic, and without the fluidity of the Minoan style. Though, of course, it can't compare with the richness of the Tutankhamun death mask, which is this magnificent mask that Howard Carter found back in the 1920s, a superb mask of the young ruler. Down here, though, we get something which perhaps gives us an indication of Minoan style more. This is a dagger blade, and you've got the iron of the dagger there, but in the center, you have a hunting scene, really quite small. It's only just over 14 inches long, but what you've got is these men hunting. And notice they've got these figure-of-8 shields, and they're again quite geometric. Narrow waists, profile, hunting. And the craftsmanship here, they're using gold and silver and niello. Now, some of you may know about niello. I've never actually seen it made, but it's actually silver mixed with copper and then with sulfur. and you get this black. This is the yellow part. Tremendous craftsmanship. And it's quite a narrative scene because look, the lion has brought this hunter down. He's lying there. And so we've got this narrative of actually the hunt going on. Very beautiful, tight design, but belonging really to a different geometric world from the one that is going to flourish in Greece. Next slide, please. That geometric period starts to end really at the end of the 7th century and into the beginning of the 6th century. And we've got an array here which I'm going to take you through. We've got here an Apollo from Thebes, and we know it has an inscription. It was dedicated by Mantiklos. Again, it's a votive offering to Apollo, and it is asking Apollo to protect and help. And we're used to offerings now. Offerings beseeching, if you like, a prayer, in this case to the gods, but we see it also, of course, in Christianity, and particularly in the Orthodox Church, where you see people putting tokens on icons. Sometimes it's quite basic health reasons, you know, an arm, a leg, an injured hand, or whatever. All creating this idea of some sympathetic or contagious magic. Very geometric in style, this triangular waist, triangular thorax with pinched waist, and look at the wonderful hairstyle and the triangular face and the eyes. Miniature little bit of bronze. But then, as we move into the archaic period, something happens in Greek art which is to shape it for the rest of its development, and of course to shape Western art. What we've got here are two limestone sculptures of Cleobis and Biton. We think it may be by Polymedes because there's an inscription on the base, and it's dedicated to Delphi from the city of Argos, and we're dating it round about 580 before the Christian era. They're quite big, 6'5½", twins, and we know who they are and the story about them because the story is told in the ancient historian Herodotus. Some of you will know about Herodotus, but Herodotus was a wonderful writer. He was actually the first person I had to study in Greek when I was learning the Greek language, the ancient Greek language, and he was such fun to read. He was an anthropologist, a traveler, a historian. He got ticked off sometimes being called the father, not of history, but of lies. But many of the things he's told us about have actually turned out to be true. But this is a great story. And the story is that the wise Athenian called Solon, who created laws for Athens, was left Athens and went to what is now Turkey, Asia Minor, to the kingdom of Lydia as a guest of the king. And he was sat having a wonderful feast. And the king of Lydia was called Croesus, from which we, of course, get the saying, rich as Croesus. Very rich, wonderful kingdom. And the king was full of himself. And at the feast, he turned to Solon and said, "You have a reputation for being very wise. Now tell me, who is the happiest man in the world?" And Solon came back almost straight away and said, "Well, there's this Athenian I can tell you about." And Croesus was a bit puzzled. He said, "Well, wait, this Athenian, I've never heard of him. What did he do that was so great?" "Well, he had 2 sons, and he died fighting for his country." "Well, that seems a bit odd," said Croesus. "That's a bit odd that he could be the happiest man. He's dead. That's a bit weird. Well, tell me then, who's the second most happiest?" Thinking that Solon was bound to flatter him and say, "Well, you must be." But he didn't. He said, "Cleobis and Biton." So who are they? Well, he said they're twins from Argos, and their mother was a priestess at the temple of Artemis in Argos. And one day she wanted to go to the temple to do her rites, and all the oxen were out in the fields, working in the fields. And the 2 brothers, her sons, said, "Don't worry, mother, we'll take you in." And they harnessed themselves up and took her off in the cart and brought her to the temple. And she went into the temple, and as mothers do, she prayed to Artemis, and she said, "Can you bless my two sons and give them the greatest blessing they can have. And when she came out of the temple, they were lying asleep, never to wake again. Now, Croesus, of course, thought this was a balmy story, didn't really understand what was going on. And Solon was trying to make the point that you can't say you're happy until actually your life is over. You've had the happiest life. And of course, what happened with Croesus was that he was to go into a war against the Persian Empire and be defeated by Cyrus. And the story goes that Cyrus was going to have him burnt, and he put him on a pyre and was going to burn him to death. And Croesus cried out, "Oh, Solon, you were so right." And Cyrus, being a curious man, said, "What's he saying?" "Croesus, what are you saying?" And Croesus told him the story. And then Apollo brought a rainstorm, and Croesus was saved. But the point of the story is quite interesting. But the dedication of these two brothers was important for Argos because they were the heroes of Argos. And now look at them. Here we have two young men, and they go under the name, the Greek term, kouros, a young man. They're standing absolutely straight, 1 foot forward, hands by their side, and naked. Now, next door, I put as a comparison the statue of Chedamun Setimu. And here we have an Egyptian sculpture, hands by the side, 1 foot forward, absolutely the same style, but of course wearing a kilt. Now, what has happened here? Well, we know actually from Herodotus, the author I just mentioned, that he says the Greeks were the first to go and live in Egypt as a foreign group, as an expat group, because they provided military service for the pharaohs. And of course, what we see both in Greek art and Greek architecture, though I'm not going to touch on architecture tonight, what we see is the huge influence of Egypt upon the Greek artists, the amazing influence that they have. And the difference is the Greeks see these men as heroes, very important heroes, and heroes close to the gods. The gods don't need clothes, the heroes don't need clothes, and they celebrate them as young men who are preparing to fight for their city-state, for Argos. Athleticism, and of course we all know about the Olympics, and Greek athletes ran in the nude. Next slide, please. Now, the one on the left from the Metropolitan is the old Kouros style, and as we move into the 5th century, look what's happened. The Critias boy, as it's called, because we think it may be by Critias, though there's very little evidence that that Greek sculpture actually did this one. Look at him. We've got what's called, the Italians call contrapposto. We've actually got the hips tilting as one leg goes forward. The anatomy now is softer and more relaxed, idealized, yes, but this is very naturalistic. So the Greeks are now taking us down the road of naturalism. Next slide, please. And when we find Greek bronzes, which are very rare, we can understand the value of the power and the value of Greek architecture. Most of the Greek sculptures we see now are actually Roman copies because they're done in stone, and they don't have the same strength and vitality. Look at these two bronzes. They'll be very familiar to many of you. On the left, the Charioteer of Delphi, found because it was buried under an earthquake in 375 BC when there was this earthquake. Therefore, it came out relatively intact. We've lost the left arm. There was a chariot, and we've got parts of the horses. Dedicated by Polyzelus from Gela in Sicily when he won the Pythian Games. And on the right, we have the Artemisium bronze out of the sea from the Cape of Artemisium, just north, the north end of the island of Euboea, found in the sea back in 1926. Now, why is the charioteer clothed? Because if he's a Greek athlete and a hero, he should be naked. And we think maybe he was a slave, and slaves didn't have the honor. They didn't have the honor of being allowed to be naked. But on the right, we have a god. Now, there's an argument about whether it's Zeus or Poseidon, because whatever he was throwing, thunderbolt or triton, has been lost from his right hand. But he's over life size. Look at him, the power, the strength, but the severity. And we often call this period, this earlier period, the severe period. Fantastic piece of bronze. Now remember, the bronze working, this was done by what's called the lost wax technique. You made a mannequin of clay, you put wax on it, you carved the wax, then you covered the wax in clay, you fired it, the wax melted out, you poured the bronze in, and that's the lost wax technique. That technique was lost when the ancient world collapsed and was only rediscovered in the Renaissance. Amazing piece of work. Of course, they had to do it in parts, and then those parts were welded together seamlessly. An amazing sculpture. Next one, please. Just wanted to show you the charioteer's head, because it's the detail that is just so amazing, and the skill and technique, the vitality of the charioteer. The band round his head was silver, his eyes are onyx and silver eyelashes and copper lips, and the detail again of the head cast in one piece, just superb. And probably a rather different color, because the bronze has quite changed. And in fact, when he was first excavated, he was quite blue. And
Tim, we've lost you just for a second. I'll wait for you to come back. Tim, we got to he was quite blue before you disappeared for a few.
Well, you missed nothing. He's just gone green now. So it's gone green. Next slide, please. I must hurry us along because, as usual, I'm going on too long. Now, look at these two. Many of you will know this. These are the famous Riati bronzes, found in 1972 off the coast of southern Italy, Calabria. And they just stunned. They stunned the experts in the ancient world. We were not expecting these two. There's been so much speculation about them. Probably loot being taken back by the Romans to Italy, but not conclusively known that is so. Two warriors, still charmingly known as A on your left and B on your right. A, the more complete one, B's lost his helmet, both of them carrying shields and spears, and rugged, huge strength. And you look at them and you think initially, wow, these are great specimens. But of course, anatomically, they're not actually achievable. However much you trained, you're not going to end up looking like that. But they've got the contrapposto, they've got the strength. And look at the bronze A, look at his face and his hair. I mean, the skill, the bronze skill, and the vitality of his beard, and again, the eyes, just power and vitality just screaming out, but still in a way slightly stylized because of this very severe style. These are the ultimate athletes fighting for their city-state, whether it's Athens or Argos or Thebes. This is the military, and you have to understand that these city-states required their young men to be fit. That's why the games started. They had to do the fighting. They were too small to have professional soldiers. So these are ordinary citizens. It may be, and it'd be nice if this is true, but we can't prove it. It may be that this was done by the great sculptor of Athens, Phidias, and that they were dedicated to Delphi as part of a celebration of the defeat of the Persians by the Athenians, by the Greeks. Next slide, please. And just because it's been a bit sexist, let's see what was happening to the women at this time. Of course, not naked, and more stylized and more restrained, because it was a very patriarchal society. You have to remember, Greek women couldn't go out on their own, and they had to go out veiled. And we've got many stories, law stories, about how they had to be accompanied with chaperones and so on. So it was quite a controlled life for Greek women. We think, of course, the democratic system in Athens and how that must have given freedom. Well, it gave freedom to men, but not to women or to slaves or to foreigners. But anyway, back to the sculpture. On the left, we have this wonderful, stylized, archaic sculpture which we don't know where it came from. It ended up in the museum in Auxerre in France. We think it has some Cretan connections because notice she's bare-breasted and a wasp waist, and we think it's almost she's a transition between the Minoan and the archaic style because the hairstyle is quite archaic with those plaits coming down. If we move on to the Peplos Corrie next door, we're into the 6th century. She's a wonderful figurine, only 3 feet high, 3 foot 10, very small, beautifully proportioned though, and again found on the Acropolis within the debris alongside the Critias boy. And we've got, of course, the remains of her, the painting and decoration. And you have to remember this with Greek sculpture. We look at Greek sculpture now and we see the pristine whiteness of it, and we sort of accept that as having its own aesthetic. But the Greeks like to paint their sculptures, and the lurid colors in some ways, but the dynamic colors of the reconstruction, which was done by the archaeological department in Cambridge, gives you an idea of what Greeks would have actually seen. And we know she had some sort of fixture on her head because there's a hole fixed to the back of her head. And on her right hand, she may have been carrying something as well, because again, there's a drilled hole, deliberately drilled. So that's the transition again from the archaic through into the classical. And then this small plaque of Athena mourning, and she's looking down, we think probably at a tombstone, and look at her robes and her posture, beautifully done, this crisp, clean feel, but also quite emotional. Is she sad? Is she mourning? What's going on in her mind? Next slide, please. And again, perhaps the epitome of the classical style and how the female figure is portrayed at this period. This, of course, is from the East Pediment of the Parthenon and is now in the British Museum. I'm not going to go into the controversy over the Parthenon sculptures, but we think, of course, this by Phidias. There is an art historian who recently argued that these are in fact Roman copies of the Greek originals because of the pollution and the breaking up that might have happened on the Parthenon. Now, that's not generally accepted, that theory, but it is a theory that's interesting. But just look at the way these, we think, goddesses are portrayed. On the right, leaning back, voluptuous, with all these wonderful folds, is Aphrodite, we think. Her mother, Dione, nursing her, and then possibly Hestia on the left, the goddess of the hearth. But it's the competence, the skill with which this marble has been carved, which becomes an example, an epitome of the classical sculpture and the way the robes fall, and how that's repeated again and again, right the way through the classical world, but also after the Renaissance. Next slide, please. And how the classical has moved on. We saw the severe style with those wonderful Riace bronzes. Here we have what may be an original marble sculpture, a Greek one, from Olympia, buried in an earthquake right at the end of the 3rd century after Christ, where the temple collapsed. And it seems to be Hermes bearing the child Dionysus. But look at the pose here now, almost too voluptuous. Certainly the curves, the polish on this sculpture has a sexuality about it that doesn't emanate power, but emanates a closeness, a warmth that is quite almost camp in the way it's presented. Quite different. And this is how classical sculpture moved. As the city-states began to fall apart, you had less of the military and more of the everyday, if you like, pleasurable parts of life, the sumptuousness of classical life. Next slide, please. And I concentrated on the sculpture as the medium because it shows the change so well. But of course, we've lost a lot of wall painting. We know the Greeks had wall paintings. They had art galleries. Even in the Acropolis, there was an art gallery, and we've lost all that, sadly. But we do have the vase painting. The vase painting, though, is very stylized. And on the left, you've got the black figure art style, Achilles and Penthesilea, a very poignant moment where the queen of the Amazons fights Achilles, the hero, and as Achilles is about to kill Penthesilea, they look at each other and fall in love. Crazy story if you like, but see, it's very schematic, it's very patterned, with the paint, which is actually the way they fire it rather than they paint it on, although in her case there is white paint to indicate that she's female, but they're also inscribed, so you've actually got it inscribed with a very sharp tool, making those patterns, and that's the black figure. It's very attractive, but it is within the stylization, and it doesn't develop in the same way that sculpture has developed. The red figure is much more flexible, because with red figure, what you actually do is paint in the background, and the figures then are detailed. And you notice this is from a cantharus, a drinking cup. You've got Cassandra and Hector, but look how, again, he's now almost, and so you can see that same stance that you had from Hermes, with the weight on one foot, the contrapposto, a much more flexible and languid figure than you had from the early classical, where they're also tough and severe. Now we move into a different period. Next slide, please. And again, I put this one on because I can tell you an anecdote with this one as well, another anecdote, another bosun story. This is from the tomb of Philip II of Macedon. And there's some wonderful wall paintings there, badly damaged, I'm afraid, but they give you some idea of the flexibility of Greek and Hellenic painting. What you've got actually there is Hades abducting Persephone. And of course, that is the story of how winter takes away fertility, but Persephone returns as spring. And you've got that whole cycle built into a Greek myth. You can't see it very well, but the detail of the face and the liveliness and the action, you can feel the power, the chariot, and Persephone falling as she is dragged away. Amazing piece of painting, and it's a shame that it's suffered so bad over the time. But on the right, you've got a tiny little ivory head of Philip II, which helped in the identification of the tomb in Vagina in northern Greece. It's only a few inches high in ivory, but in the tomb was found bones and a skull. And this is the interesting part of the story, because on the right, you've got a reconstruction of Philip II's head based on that skull. And it was done in Manchester. There's a team in Manchester under Dr. Prague who did this reconstruction. They've now done many reconstructions for archaeologists of faces, and you've probably seen they've done a whole series now on Roman emperors, mainly from their sculptures rather than from their skulls, of course. But because the skull actually survived in the tomb, they were able to reconstruct Philip's face. Now you'll notice his right eye is missing, and we know that he was at the siege of Methone. He lost his eye when an arrow went through, and so this was matched in the skull, and so in the reconstruction. Now the little anecdote I have to tell you is my old professor of archaeology, who's still alive, 88 years old, was a friend of the Greek archaeologist Mannerism Andronicus, who discovered the tomb. And I was in Greece at one stage, and Richard Tomlinson said, "Would I mind bringing something back on the plane?" I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Well, it's the head of Alexander." I said, "What the head?" He said, "Well, actually, it's the wax head, the reconstruction, which has been as an exhibition in Thessaloniki, and it's coming back to Manchester. Would I pick it up and put it on the plane?" I was very nervous because I just had this fantasy, the imagination, being stopped at customs, and they're opening this box, which had travelled with me inside the cabin. They're opening this box and saying, "What have you got here, sir?" Oh. Anyway, I had to put that anecdote in. Next slide, please. Now, with the death of Philip, of course, the next ruler of Macedon was Alexander the Great. I don't have to go into all his conquests, but this was his empire. Just look at it, a fantastic empire, all the way over to India here. And of course, it actually get to India, then mutinied and said, we've had enough, we want to go home after 10 years of fighting. This massive empire became the Hellenic world. And the Hellenistic world, as we might call it, the Hellenistic world populated by Greeks and Macedonians mixing with Persians, Syrians and Egyptians. But it dominated the culture. And of course, that meant Greek art and Greek sculpture permeated throughout that world and influenced many of the other cultures alongside it. Next slide, please. And Hellenistic art is rich and almost baroque and overflowing in its smoothness and its voluptuousness. On the left, we have a coin. This is a tetradrachm of Alexander, actually minted after his death at a mint in Syria called Arados. Now, just look at his head, all the curls and the hair and the wonderful artistic skill. And you notice he's got a horn there on his head. That's the horn of Ammon, because, of course, he was very much associated with the shrine of Ammon, the first place he went to when he was in Egypt. And he associated Ammon with Zeus and so on. But this coin became a standard coin, and rulers throughout the Hellenistic world copied this style, wanting to be like Alexander. Youthful, full of energy, and we know how rulers now want to hold on to that. Don't get many rulers showing themselves aged, though, of course, someone like Joe Biden cannot escape it because the television cameras are there. But the idea is this youthful, vigorous ruler. And then, of course, on the right, perhaps the most famous female sculpture from the ancient world, the so-called Venus de Milo from the island of Milos, discovered and brought to the Louvre. She's a large lady, 6'8", known for her voluptuousness. The Venus de Milo actually is one story of propaganda, because why the Venus de Milo was so praised in France was that France had just suffered really badly because Napoleon had gone around Europe conquering and looting and had brought so many treasures back to Paris. And then, of course, when he was defeated, for example, the horses in Venice, the famous horses from San Marco, they all had to go back, and he lost, or France lost to Venus. So when the Venus de Milo came, they celebrated it. I'm not sure it is the most beautiful epitome of a Greek goddess, but anyway, she is again curvy, voluptuous, wonderful robes, rather empty, I think, face, but nevertheless typical, I think, of the Hellenistic style of sculpture. Next slide, please. And now we move into the last section, just a little bit over time, but I hope to get you there in another 10 minutes, into the Roman period. Here we are, the Roman period. Republican art, imperial art, late antique art. And we're going to see Roman realism, practical. We're going to see some grand idealization and propagandistic narrative. And we're going to see funerary portraits. We'll see Augustus, the founder of the empire, if you like, Trajan's column, and some portraiture. And the big date, I suppose, for Roman historians is the death of Julius Caesar, which marks the end of the Republic and the beginning of the empire. And then the end, if you like, of Roman imperial art into the late antique period down the Emperor Constantine. On to the next slide then. Now, this is a bit of Etruscan art. The Etruscans, of course, were to the north of Rome, were very influential, particularly in terms of the military of Roman history. And prior to the Romans really discovering the Greeks, or Magna Graecia, the Greeks in southern Italy and mainland Greece, the Etruscans had the most cultural influence. And look at this husband and wife from a first century tomb from Volterra. Look at their faces. Here they are going to the next world together, and their faces are quite crude, but quite severe. And certainly the wife has a touch of realism which you would never find in the idealized Greek sculpture. So we've got this practical sort of realism. Next slide, please. And it manifests itself in early Roman portraiture. Look at these two here. On the left, we have a patrician with the busts of his ancestors. Romans had a form of ancestor worship where they kept the busts of their ancestors, and then at each funeral, they would parade them. And it was partly, of course, to say, look where I come from. Look at my pedigree. My ancestors were patricians, senators, rulers, generals. So you were showing off your status. And status and hierarchy in Roman society, class society, was incredibly important. Remember, you had patricians and plebs, but you also had senators, equestrians, citizens. Everybody had a layer, freemen, slaves, very hierarchical society. One of the paradoxes of Roman society is, and particularly during the imperial period, it is so hierarchical, and yet there is massive social mobility. There's a point where the grandson of a slave becomes the Roman emperor. Extraordinary sort of social mobility. Perhaps the social mobility we're going to see more of in America when you looked at the inauguration of the president and how it represented the different facets of society in America. That happens in the imperial time. But in the Republican time, you have to be very status conscious, and you're a patrician. And look what the patricians look like on the right. This is the head of a patrician from Auriculum, a marble head now in Torlonia, in the Palazzo there in Rome. Look at the grim face, warts and all, every crease. No idealization here at all, except, of course, it is a form of idealization, because what this sculpture is saying is, I am the senator, the Cato-type person who actually, Cato famed for sticking to the law and being all the time absolutely firm in his beliefs and his understanding of what Roman culture and Roman society stood for. He was the man, of course, Cato, Cato the Elder, who got rid of Carthage, determined to have it destroyed. So very stubborn, determined, ruthless patrician, all conveyed in this very realistic form of sculpture, which was known as verism. And of course that continues, particularly amongst rulers, to get across their personality and their control right the way through Western art. So portraiture now has not just taken on what you saw in the Greek idealism, where we just saw types and not individuals. We're now seeing individuals being portrayed by artists, not just the idealized type. Next slide, please. And here is a mixture of this. Augustus presenting himself, this is me, and at the same time, this is me forever, idealized. There are no sculptures of Augustus growing old. His coins, look at the coin minted there after his death in what is now France, Lugdunum, showing him as a young virile ruler. This is the propaganda of the ruler, and we see that in every totalitarian state. We see pictures of the ruler and they never grow old. Well, even our dear Queen doesn't get too old on the stamps. Youth, vigor, and the pose is almost, well, it's a classical Greek pose. So he's taken on Greek sculpture, because the Romans were totally in awe of Greek art, and they stole it, they copied it, it infused their society. And even that lovely little cameo, which is now in the British Museum, from the Blancas, Count Blancas collection, not quite sure where it originated from, again shows him this young, virile ruler. So it's an idealization based on a reality. That's how he started off, but he ends up. And even the propaganda, you probably can't see it very well, but on his cuirass here, he's actually, the Roman is receiving the lost standards that Marcus Crassus lost at the Battle of Carrhae against the Persians, famous defeat in 55 BC. But there it is, returned. Next slide, please. And this is the Roman Empire, just to remind you of its vastness. All of this was influenced by Greek art and Greek culture through the Romans, taking it, transporting it as far away from Hadrian's Wall all the way over to the Arabian Gulf. Next slide, please. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of wall painting because we can understand some of the Greek style within Roman wall painting. And of course, these are the famous paintings from Pompeii, preserved because of the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. Wonderful paintings. We're looking here at the Villa of Mysteries, just outside the walls of Pompeii, with these wonderful paintings here of some sort of mystery cult. And we're not quite sure exactly whether it's the cult of Bacchus or what it is. But look at this panel here, this wonderful panel. This woman is being beaten by a winged figure around the corner here. And we think this lady's clashing her cymbals to drown out her cries. So it's an initiation ceremony with the priestesses looking on. And we know there were many secret rites, particularly, say, the cult of Bacchus was very popular with women in the Republican period. And it's likely that this may mirror this. We're just not sure which particular cult. But the idea of belonging to this religion, which was quite secret, but tolerated by Roman society because it tended to be polytheistic and not monotheistic. And in my last lecture, I talked about how Christianity, of course, crossed that boundary and how it became persecuted by the Romans. And then this lovely little wall painting down here, a portrait found in the house of Terentius Neo, so we think it may be him and his wife. It has realism, but also charm and delicacy. And his wife seems to be holding some writing tablets. He's holding a scroll, perhaps just signifying his success in life. A legal entitlement to the house, perhaps. Unlikely to be his university diploma, but showing his status and his charming wife. And can't see very well in the slide, but she has lovely hairstyle. And she's looking out straight at us. They're looking at us with honest eyes. These are real people, but at the same time wanting to tell us something about them. And when you look at the wall paintings in Pompeii, they all have some story about the building, about the people there, and how they fit into Roman culture. But the basis of these paintings are the Greek artists, many of them, of course, taken captive as slaves and then freedmen working in Italy for the Romans. Next slide, please. But Roman culture did contribute something, again through this hierarchy and this power, the symbolism of propaganda, the narrative. And this is perhaps the most famous Roman narrative of all. Trajan's column, a symbol, don't have to say it, but I will, a phallic symbol of power by the Emperor Trajan from his Dacian wars. And it's like a newsreel. It tells us the story of the Roman army and their campaigns. It's just amazing story. You can now see it in the Civil Museum at ground level with the plaster cast. You can see every bit of that story. The Emperor Trajan himself appears about 8 times to reinforce his importance in this campaign. But here's his status in Rome, saying, I am the emperor who conquered Dacia, and these are my campaigns. He had a little library next door, and he had his diaries there. And we think that this was probably more like his journals than diaries. This sculpture was probably based on his journals. You can see Trajan here is addressing the troops. There they are. And he's up on the podium addressing them. And down here, they're building a camp. And the detail is they've got their shields and helmets piled up, and they're working away, and this man's making a ditch outside the camp, and they're building up stones there. All the detail of how the Roman army operated. Technically, of course, the army was very brilliant for its time, very superior, which had given the Romans their empire. It was through military conquest. We're almost at the end. The next slide, please. Just some portraits to take us through the evolution of imperial portraits. We've got here in the Pushkin Museum, Livia, the wife of Augustus, a Roman matron, severe, orderly, careful. As the empire develops, we all know about its decadence from people like Caligula and onwards. We move to this lady in the Flavian period. Look at this hairstyle. Absolutely amazing. And of course, it changes the technical skills too. A lot more use has to be made of the drill to create all those wonderful curls. Again, the idea of the Roman lady now not so Puritan, but much more aesthetic and more beautiful through her status. And then a bronze, a wonderful bronze that has survived, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. It survived because the Romans thought in the medieval period that it was Constantine, the founder of Christianity, and therefore they didn't dare melt it down. But in fact, we know it's Marcus Aurelius, and it's gilded, a wonderful bronze of him on horseback, and again the face. Look at this bronze work, the beard and the hairstyle and the robes, a symbol of his power. Equestrian statues put you up higher above your subjects. You're looking down at them. Having a horse is power, looking down on them is power. Roman art, imperial art, is so often at this level, this quality is about the status of the emperor. And look at this emperor down here, how the empire has moved on. The 3rd century crisis, harsh, severe. Well, tell me what was he before he became emperor? Of course, he was the ruthless general who defeated the barbarians and so on. Philip the Arab didn't live very long, as you see, as emperor. He didn't last very long. He's in the 3rd century crisis, where emperors, 21 emperors in just over 50 years, terrible turmoil, civil wars, but also assassinations, and the military were on top. And he epitomizes, doesn't he, the ruthless, hard-nosed general. And my final slide. And what a contrast. And yet, we're not moving very far. The end of the 3rd century, and those who came to the Diocletian talk will recognize this as the Tetrarchy, the 4 emperors, Diocletian, Maximian, Constantius, and Galerius. There they are. What's the message? We're not interested now in idealism of their beauty, their naturalism. They have become schematic, abstracts, because they're telling us this message of power. They grip their swords, they live by the sword, and they're telling us they're a brotherhood. They're clasping each other, which of course, historically, we know in the end was false, because they all fall out. But it's this propaganda, this image that they want to portray. And then the final slide, Constantine. Oh, can I go back? Sorry, back to Constantine. The final, I should have said the final portraiture of Constantine. This colossal head, it's over 8 feet high, on a sculpture which unfortunately we've only got the bits of, which must have been over 40 feet high. What is a sculpture 40 feet high telling its subjects? And look at his face. This man is in touch with the other world as well as our world. He is transcendental. He is with the gods, and of course became the God, the Christian God. He is mystical, he is magical, he is transcendental, he is powerful, and he is in another world. And this sets the tone now. This late antique style sets the tone for the medieval world, which we'll look at in the next session. It is an art that is abstract because it is the message that's important, not the naturalism. It doesn't have to look like everyday life. It doesn't have to look like ordinary people. It has to convey something separate, another world, a world that you can aspire to. Final slide, which is a thank you. And just to summarize, where have we got to? We've moved from the prehistoric art, which is about a practical element of capturing animals, of promoting fertility through a sympathetic magic of trying to control the environment. And we've moved through a form of naturalism which the Greeks evolved and developed because they wanted the ideal youth, the ideal person, the athlete to defend their kingdom. It moved then to the voluptuousness of pleasure of the Hellenistic world, and finally to the practical world where the Romans borrowed and adapted, and finally send you this powerful message at the end that what's important for the ruler to rule is your understanding that he connects with another world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim, for a romp through thousands of years of history. What's quite a task you've set yourself here, but I have yet to find something that you are not an absolute font of knowledge on yet. And thank you so much for also coping so ably with a slightly unsteady Wi-Fi connection, I think, and with the various vagaries of my laptop. Just what we wanted, I'm sure you'll agree, for our very first talk of 2021, but then it being 2021, we're all getting a little bit used to things not going quite according to plan. So thank you so much, Tim. I'm just going to ask everybody if they would take themselves off mute just for a second.
Great. I am going to stick quite closely to a couple of very dense questions with multiple questions inside. So I hope people who've asked things, you get an answer, or that you've got loads from Tim to take away and research frantically yourselves, because I am definitely an information overwhelm. Not in a bad way though. It was fascinating. Thanks so much, Tim. So first of all, we started with 2D art on walls, stationary art, and then moved into 3D. And at what point did that start happening? And was there a sense of one type being superior to the other? And the second part of that question is, was there a dialogue between the creators of those artworks? Did they kind of collaborate within schools, or did they kind of go out by themselves into a cave and just go for it?
Yes, well, the 3D, of course, you've got what you start with the cave art, on the wall art, and then you've got the figurines, and there's the figurines, and then those are developed once you've got permanent settlements. Can you imagine when you're making figurines and you're moving around a lot, you can't have large sculptures or whatever. You haven't got that time. You're using something that's really quite small and portable. And then when you've got the settled settlements, the rulers start using art to convey messages. They're putting across their status and so on. What is the most interesting little bit of this is when you get to the city-states, which the city-states are democratic in a way. I mean, you have to, of course, recognize that it is the males who are, but they are equals, and what they are looking for is something else, and that is the idealization, or to put themselves closer to their gods, and they do it primarily through athletes. It's athleticism. And so you then get this admiration of the natural world. And what happens then? The artists start being celebrated as stars. Prior to that, artists aren't really known. It's the patron who's important.
We've lost you, Tim.
We'll give him just a couple of seconds.
How are you doing? Am I back on?
Yes, we finished at patron.
Well, I'm just saying that during the Greek classical period, we know the names of the artists because they become celebrated because they're so skillful and people want their product. And they become cities vie against each other to buy those artists in. So the artists become quite mobile because they're known for their skills. So people like Phidias can travel around. Praxiteles goes around getting commissions in the same way that the Renaissance artists become known to us.
Yes.
Did I cover all the bits?
Yes, the beginning of the cult of celebrity. And if I can tack on another question just to the end of that. So was it the whole civilization that really saw these artworks and felt ownership of them? Or was it just the richer patrons and a niche of people?
Because of the pride in the city-states and Greek city-states, people felt they own them as well. They were theirs. And that it explains why you get wonderful phenomena like the Parthenon and the sculptures there. They're pride of their city, and they try and beat the sculptures at Thebes, and they do better than the ones at Corinth, and so on. So there's a rivalry through art, just in the same way that they're through the Olympic Games or the Pythian Games, they're competing. This element of competition pushes art forward stylistically. Then that comes to a bit of an abrupt halt with the collapse of the city-states and the dominance of Macedonia and the Hellenistic states. And then it's the rulers again who are back in control, and what they are conveying their message of power, of status. And that continues in a way. You start in Rome with each patrician wanting to show how good they are, and they're buying up Greek art and so on. And then, of course, once it becomes imperial art, the emperors take over. And you get quite a dichotomy of art. But it's still so embedded within the culture that you get a place like Pompeii, which is relatively only a short period into the imperial period, and you can see how art is loved for decoration by the Romans everywhere. They've got art everywhere.
Fantastic. Thank you. Goodness, there's so much. And also even just the Paleolithic period, that was kind of encompassing most of the entirety of human history, and yet we have relatively few relics, which is just incredible to me. And that leads on to the kind of second half of the questions, which is slightly more maybe conceptual, and that looking back at these things, especially to the animals, does represent quite a big leap in human cognition and the way that we interacted with nature, and perhaps in a way that some indigenous communities in the world still do. But now that humans are kind of a geological force, this word, the Anthropocene, we've talked about art in the Holocene, art in the Anthropocene, and how that has become a term which has kind of captured an artistic or an intellectual zeitgeist, quite catchy and popularized by people like Haraway. But do you think that term is useful, given that what we've just seen in the progression, it seems that actually man himself or woman is the most thoroughly anthropomorphized of all of the images we've seen, and the kind of rules within that fits? Well, so yeah, the kind of the direction in this new Anthropocene.
Well, we see really, in the modern art world, we see that huge change again, which is about art being the expression of the individual. So it's the individualism which becomes so powerful. So art can take on any form, from the pile of bricks to the unmade bed, because it's done by an individual. They had that thought, and of course it becomes quite controversial in that sense. But you do have popular art, and you might say Banksy is a perfect example of Anthropocene art, in the sense that Banksy and the way he operates, because it's conceptual, and it's the story around that which is as important as what he does. You would not see that in any other period. That doesn't exist in that way. There's no artists doing that. There's some graffiti in Pompeii, and there's graffiti throughout the medieval period and into the Renaissance, but they're not trying to present a work of art with a particular message. It's usually they're usually satire. Actually, the graffitis are usually satirical about someone else. But yes, the world has changed, and now, of course, we've got technology to create art. So you don't have to be able to be a skillful drawer, or you don't have to have a particular eye. You have to have a concept and a view, and then technology can do it for you.
Yes, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. As I was looking at your wonderful examples, I was looking around my own room and thinking it looks a bit bleak. But there we go. Wonderful.
You got something out of this talk.
There are kind of more fragments of questions. I'll just double check that there's nothing else.
I wonder whether maybe, Nina, you can take a copy of all of the questions that you've been submitting.
Yes, and any more we can answer.
Might be able to sort something out for sending those around to people afterwards. Tim, if you'd be up for that.
Yeah, sure. And I do apologise for going over time.
Not at all. It was wonderful, and it's very exciting that there's more on the horizon. So please do, everyone, come along for the next instalments.
It makes you realise, though, how mad it was to choose such a big subject and try and boil it down into
Hitchhiker's Guide to Human Creativity.
but in a way, what I want to sort of convey, and it was deliberately supposed to be lightning, is that change and those changes in style and how they influence society.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. We cannot accuse you ever of lacking ambition. And I think we will continue to enjoy your enormous amount of energy and enthusiasm and just knowledge about this over the next couple of talks. We'll be sending out some dates for those at some point soon. Our plan is to spread them over the year with the hope that by the end of the year, we might actually be able to welcome some people at least in person, as well as those of you who are going to be joining online at the same time. So that's our aim and our goal, and we very much hope that we'll get there before too long. But thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Nina, for excellent Q&A session. I'm sorry it was so short. Thank you, Tim, for just brilliant talk. Thank you, everybody who's turned up this evening. It's lovely to have so many of you here with us. We have got loads and loads of talks coming up over the course of this term, one of which you might be particularly interested in because Tim sort of touched on some of it this evening, which is that we have Professor Caroline Wilkinson, who is the director of Face Lab, who specialise in digital reconstruction of faces from archaeological remains. So we saw Philip II of Macedon's head that Tim said had been reconstructed with one eye missing. Professor Caroline Wilkinson has done the very famous one of Richard III. She did our very own John of Wheathampstead, the abbot at St Albans, and she'll be coming to talk to us again on Zoom on the 4th of February about how she does that, how they can reconstruct faces just from archaeological remains. So do keep an eye on our web pages for that, or drop me an email if you'd like to be added to our mailing list. I won't keep you for any longer, but please do join me one more time in taking yourselves off mute and offering a very warm round of applause as a thank you for Tim.
Thanks.